Hi, it's T, and I'm here to talk about race, religion, and really good literature. I have a friend who teaches literature at another school. Right before the school year began, he was told that he would not be allowed to teach Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird this year. This news was delivered by the school's diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, and the concern was that some of the students of color in this class might be a little rattled by the depiction of Jim Crow South laid out in the novel. Now, I don't know the school. I don't know the teachers involved. I don't know its culture. I especially don't know these students and their families. So I have absolutely nothing to say about that diversity practitioner's decision. For all I know, it was absolutely the right thing to do. I did, however, want to take a minute and talk about race and religion in To Kill a Mockingbird. And here's my thesis. The problem with To Kill a Mockingbird is not, in fact, its depiction of the Jim Crow South, the cruelty of white supremacy, and what was perpetrated on people of color, especially black people, throughout the former Confederacy and the country as a whole. That's not the problem with the book. The problem with the book, the near fatal flaw of this excellent, majestic novel, is in fact bad religion. I'll say more about that in a minute, but first of all, I have to say this. If you have not read this book, or you haven't read it in a while and might get back to it, stop watching. Turn this thing off. Okay, no kidding. This is one extended litany of plot spoilers, and let me just say this about the book. It is one of the best ever written in the English language. It is a masterclass in author's choices, narrative voice, and development of theme. You're simply not going to find a book that's a whole lot better than this one. And in this little talk, I'm going to completely destroy it if you haven't read it. So let's talk about the history a little bit. In my humble opinion, and it's a pretty humble opinion, this book does a pretty good job of depicting Jim Crow racism in a small rural farming town in Alabama in roughly 1935. Now, this isn't to say that you're being brought face to face with the absolute worst that Jim Crow had to offer. During the time this book takes place, you probably have as many as 11 to 15 actual lynchings happening in Alabama. We don't really hear any of them mentioned. At the same time, we almost see a lynching carried out, one that would have involved violence, perhaps even fatal violence, perpetrated on a white man in the process. We see in the language of the people in the town, the attitudes of groups like the Idlers Club. We see the casual and the systemic racism that's been beaten into these folks. Then there's chapter 24, which is a step-by-step deconstruction of what deeply racist people look like even when they think they're doing good. I love this chapter. It's a tea party, and the leading women of the town are sitting around ostensibly to raise money for a missionary to help those poor Maroonahs in Africa. But bottom line, virtually everything that comes out of their mouth is hideous in its racist undertones. Atticus is truly a product of his time. Now that is both an excuse, but it's kind of an important observation. At one point he tells Scout not to use the N-word. This is not because he finds the N-word shocking and awful and a reminder of a brutal slavery past. In fact, he just tells her not to do it because it sounds common. The Finch family is aristocracy in this little town, and for all of Atticus's humility and dissembling, I think he wants his kids to kind of appear to be a cut above everyone else. We also at one point have Atticus comparing himself to Cotton Tom Heflin. He says, I'm not as radical as Cotton Tom Heflin. Well, Cotton Tom Heflin was probably one of the most disgusting racists ever to sit in the Senate. And given the current crew, that's saying something. This guy despised everything that was not white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Atticus makes him sound like an old softy. That aside, that's a piece of character, right? That aside, we're not talking about a novel that makes all of the mistakes that, let's say, Gone with the Wind indulges in, or maybe one of those textbooks circulated by the Daughters of the Confederacy. The fact of the matter is this novel kind of gets Jim Crow right. The problem with this book is not the way it addresses or portrays racism. The problem with this book is bad religion. Church as an institution, organized religion, does not play a very large role in this novel. We know that Atticus takes his kids to church regularly when he can. We also know that he doesn't sit with them. He sits off by himself singing the hymns off key and off-tempo. When the kids do go to Sunday school and they're left unsupervised, they tie each other up in the boiler room and forget about each other. It's pretty entertaining. There's one amazing chapter where Calpurnia, the family's black maid and essentially a surrogate mother, really, to Jem and Scout, takes the kids to her black church, and that's where we see a little bit of Jim Crow. The black church is impoverished. It has no ceiling, it has no hymnals, it doesn't have any of what Scout calls the impedimenta that she expects to see from her own church. The building is used as a gambling hall during the week by white men. This is segregation, and no institution stuck up for segregation, white supremacy, and racism overall more than Southern Protestant Christianity. We wouldn't have a Southern Baptist convention without a bunch of racists saying, we want to start our own church. At the same time, Scout does notice a commonality between the black church and the white church, and that is in the message that is being preached. She describes the Reverend Sykes' sermon this way. He warned his flock against the evils of heady brews, gambling, and strange women. Again, as I had often met it in my own church, I was confronted with the impurity of women doctrine that seemed to preoccupy all clergymen. So you got your racism, you got your misogyny, give me that old-time religion, baby. Why not? But the near fatal flaw in this novel is not anything that happens in a church. It has to do with the impact of this particular brand of religion when Harper Lee is developing her theme. There are two themes in this novel. The first, I think, is actually the more important of the two, even though it doesn't give the book its title. The first theme has to do with putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It has to do with empathy and the compassion that can arise when you really try to see the world through the eyes of someone else, particularly someone who is in no way like you. It's an extraordinary lesson, and this makes this book an enormous pleasure to read, particularly with adolescents. This is developed fairly early in the book. It's established, I think, in the third chapter when Atticus says to Scout, if you can learn a simple trick, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. Sir, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. This is the foundational theme of this book. There's barely a chapter that goes by where it is not touched upon in some way. The very beginning, page 3, we have Scout first meeting a new friend, Dill. And during the course of their first conversation, it becomes pretty clear that Dill does not want to talk about his father. We don't know why yet. We have no idea. Scout, 5 years old, can't pick up on this nuance, and she starts badgering him. What about your father? You've got a father, don't you? Well, what about your father? And Dill is looking more and more uncomfortable, and finally Jem has to step in and tell her to clam up. So from the very beginning of the book, we see that Scout, in fact, lacks this kind of empathy. She lacks the ability to put herself in someone else's shoes. By the end of the book, plot spoiler, the last 3 pages of the book, we have one of the most majestic payoffs on a theme ever. We have Scout literally standing on Boo Radley's front porch, right in front of the window that he would look at their shared world through. She stands there, she surveys her neighborhood from an entirely new angle, and then she retells the story of the book through Boo's eyes. It's spine-tingling, and there have been years when I've read that passage out loud to my students and gotten a little weepy. I don't know of a novel that pays off on its theme better than that. But this is the important thing to note. When Atticus is teaching Scout this radical empathy, he does not make any reference to religion whatsoever. This is pure humanism. This is pure common sense. If you really want to get along with folks, try to understand what's going on in their heads. Try to see the world from their point of view. God has nothing to do with this. This is just a good way for us to get along. And that's one of the reasons why this theme, the most prominent theme in the book, pays off so beautifully. There is, of course, another theme. This is the theme that gives the book its title. For a Christmas, Atticus arranges for Jem and Scout to get air rifles. He's not excited about it, but he knows he's raising them in a semi-rural southern town and they're going to get their hands on guns anyway, so let's get started. He tells them not to point the guns in the house, he tells them not to point them at other people, and then he says this: I'd rather you shot at tin cans in the backyard, but I know you'll go after birds. Shoot all the blue jays you want if you can hit them, but remember, it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. A little while later, we're across the street talking to Miss Maudie, and as she does throughout the book, she puts a gloss on Atticus to explain him to his own children. She says, yeah, mockingbirds don't do us any harm. They don't nest in corn cribs, they don't wreck property, they don't wake us up in the morning with their screaming. All they do is make lovely music for us to enjoy. So it really would be a sin to shoot them. Don't do harm to things that do no harm. It's so straightforward. It's right up there. It's practically at the heart of any ethical system. Don't do harm to things that don't do harm. And if Harper Lee had framed it that way, I wouldn't have an issue. But instead, she doesn't. She doesn't put it out there as a basic human truth, a basic aspect of common sense. She throws it out there as something sinful, as something connected to religion and the pseudo-morality that entails there. The scene where Atticus explains about it's a sin to kill a mockingbird, that's in the first 35 pages of the book. Harper Lee then drops that theme entirely until we get to the second half. And look at how she brings it back. It's so masterful. She starts a chapter with Scout looking at a roly-poly bug. And she's been playing with it a little bit, she's been screwing around with it, and now she's bored and she gets ready to raise her hand and kill the bug. Jem stops her. She says, why? What are you, all of a sudden into insects? What's the matter with you? He says, it's not doing you any harm, Scout. Knock it off. So we have It's a Sin to Kill a Mockingbird. 150 pages or so go by. We're brought back to the roly-poly, and then in the same chapter, we're given this image of Helen Robinson. Atticus has learned that Tom has been shot 17 times while trying to escape from prison, and he drives out to Helen's house to tell her. Along the way, he picks up Jem and Dill is the one who describes the situation to Scout later on. This is how he describes Helen Robinson's reaction to the news that her husband has been brutally murdered by prison guards. Scout, said Dill, she just fell down in the dirt. Just fell down in the dirt like a giant with a big foot just came along and stepped on her. Just ump. Dill's fat foot hit the ground, like you'd step on an ant. This is our first mockingbird. Helen Robinson's life has been destroyed by white supremacy and Jim Crow cruelty. She's been squashed like a bug. She was doing no harm, and the system harmed her irreparably. Now, the second mockingbird in this book, obviously, is Tom Robinson. And in fact, a page after we see that devastating scene with Helen, we are told about an editorial in the local paper written by Mr. Underwood, who the proprietor of the paper, the editor of the paper, who also happens to be one of the most violently racist people in the town. But even he has seen this trial and said, this has gone terribly wrong. And he writes an editorial that Scout describes this way. Mr. Underwood didn't talk about miscarriages of justice. He was writing so children could understand. Mr. Underwood simply figured it was a sin to kill cripples, be they standing, sitting, or escaping. He likened Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. Tom was a mockingbird. He did no one harm, and the system destroyed him. There is, however, a third mockingbird in this book. And this is a terrifically complicated one, and it's one that brings the religious miscarriage of morality to the fore and damn nearly destroys the project. Not quite, but it's close. The third mockingbird, of course, is Boo Radley. Spoiler alert. Seriously, man, I'm about to just go there with this book. So as we know, Bob Ewell attacked Jem and Scout Finch with a switchblade. Somehow, Boo Radley, from his house, heard the commotion and got out there in time to kill Bob Ewell with a kitchen knife. Perhaps the climactic conversation in the book that occurs in the last chapter or so, we have Atticus Finch and Heck Tate, the sheriff of Macomb County, two sworn officers of the court, meeting privately on Atticus's porch with Boo present. And they talk it over. And they decide that, in fact, they are not going to take any action with Boo Radley whatsoever. The man did commit murder. We can talk about it being in defense of children, perhaps even in self-defense. But the point is he killed somebody. And the point is we have a process for that. It might involve asking some questions. It might involve taking a deposition or two. And then it might involve, especially in a small town back in 1935, going, okay, I think we're okay here. We don't need to proceed with a prosecution. But they don't even go that far. They decide that the world will never know how Bob Ewell died. And they do this on the basis of religion. At one point in this conversation, Heck Tate says this: "There's a black boy dead for no reason," a clear reference to Tom Robinson. "And the man responsible for it's dead. Let the dead bury the dead this time, Mr. Finch. Let the dead bury the dead." Well, he's quoting Jesus. That's right out of the Bible. And on the surface of things, you kind of say, yeah, stuff sort of evens out here. But you know what? I'm sorry, somebody kills my wife. I don't get to just kill them and walk away. There's got to be a process. There's got to be some kind of legal procedure that we go through to clear everything up, tie up the loose ends, decide maybe I had good reason, and let me walk away. But they don't. Heck Tate continues his peroration. He's building up. And he says this: "I never heard tell that it's against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime from being committed, which is exactly what he did." That's Boo. "But maybe you'll say it's my duty to tell the town all about it and not hush it up. Know what had happened then? All the ladies in Macomb, including my wife, be knocking on his door bringing angel food cakes. To my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking the one man who's done you and this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, to me, that's a sin. It's a sin, and I'm not about to have it on my head. If it was any other man, it'd be different, but not this man, Mr. Finch." It would be a sin to identify Boo Radley as having saved the lives of 2 children. It would be a sin that people would line up on his porch to bring him dessert. It would be a sin that his brother Nathan would have to answer the door and say, "Yeah, you know my brother Boo, he's not going to come out here. He's shy. Thanks for the cake." It would be a sin? Are you out of your mind? So the problem here is that we decided to put all of this into theological terms. If we'd left it in secular terms, don't harm things that do no harm. If we'd left it like that, we might have been able to work this out. But instead we brought in the notion of sin, and here's the problem. There is no legitimate correlation between the Christian notion of sin and morality. There's none. Unless you're going to tell me this. Is it moral not to eat bacon? Is it immoral to put cheese on your burger? Is it moral to keep your wife from going to church in the few days after she's given birth? Is that a moral thing? I don't think so. Of the 300 plus rules laid out in the Bible, absolutely none of them stand on moral ground. If you want to play the big guns, let's trot out the Decalogue. Let's trot out the 10 Commandments. None of them is unqualified morally. You absolutely shouldn't kill anybody unless you really need to kill anybody, which, by the way, is exactly what just happened in this book. Because we put this theme in religious terms, in terms of sin, we can now bend the morality to a point where it's no longer even recognizable. Boo Radley committed murder. Absolutely no one's going to even talk to him about it. And this now goes back to the original formulation of the theme. When Atticus tells his kids it's a sin to kill a mockingbird, you will notice he also said, you can shoot all the blue jays you want. I don't recall blue jays being super harmful. They're deeply annoying. They wake you up right around dawn screaming outside your window. Maybe they might do some damage to your bird feeders, but folks, does that mean we can declare open season on these critters? This is the squishy morality of sin and Christian theology. It's a sin to kill this bird. It's just fine to destroy all the others. And there is a blue jay, a metaphorical blue jay in this book. And that, of course, is Bob Ewell, a poor, ignorant, white man, trapped in several generations of poverty. Cruel, yes. Stupid, absolutely. A racist who created the conditions that sent a black man to his death. He is a villain. He's a villain's villain. But he's a person. And we are happy that he's dead at the end of the book, in large part because We've allowed our morality to get all squishy. It's no longer the straight up humanistic, try to look at things from other people's point of view, don't harm things that do no harm. Now, we brought in sin, and that meant we brought in the possibility we can now interpret things freely. And we're so happy that Bob Ewell is dead. We think Boo Radley is awesome, and the book ends. Now, I want to be really clear. This is still one of the greatest novels ever. It's a near fatal flaw, but it's an important one. And it's one of the reasons why I love teaching this book. Because not only do you get to ask questions like, hey, is Atticus Finch really a good role model for people who want to pursue racial and social justice in America today? Really? Is he really a good model for that? It's a terrific conversation to have with your students. Another one is, hey, what is morality? Is it enough just to invoke some kind of a sky god who's going to tell you right and wrong so you can then just refer to that and pretty much do what you want in this situation? I don't know. Hey kids, let's start thinking for ourselves. That's my spiel. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really curious to see what the comments are. Keep it clean. Some of my students might read this stuff. Be blessed, be well, enjoy yourselves.